Hey everyone, Eric Rennie here, and welcome to the 48th episode of the Writ Podcast. On Monday, there's going to be two by-elections in the Miramichi area in New Brunswick. That's not the only bit of political drama we have out of the province. There's the disappearance and reappearance of the People's Alliance. There's a leadership race going on for the New Brunswick Liberals, and there's going to have to be a new leadership race for the NDP. So to break it all down, I'm joined today by Jacques Poitras. He's the provincial affairs supporter for the CBC in New Brunswick, and he's the author of The Right Fight, which is a great book if you want to read about political history in New Brunswick at the end of the 20th century and the rise of Bernard Lord. So Jacques, thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for the plug.
Yeah, well, it's a great book. There's these by-elections coming up, and I haven't had a chance to really delve into New Brunswick politics in a little while. So I think we first should start with what happened with the People's Alliance. This is a party in New Brunswick that has had a pretty big impact on the last two election campaigns, and now might be disappearing, might be reappearing. What's going on with the People's Alliance?
Yeah, and relevant to these by-elections is that they came within 35 votes of winning one of these ridings in 2018, and in the other riding, their vote count may have cost the PCs the win in 2020. So it's definitely relevant to talk about them while these by-elections are going on. So they were a populist party that was created about a decade ago, and they had their big breakthrough in 2018 when they won 3 seats, and they held the balance of power when Blaine Higgs formed a minority government. And in a really kind of astounding development in the end of March, the two surviving Alliance MLAs from the 2020 election, including the leader and founder of the party, Chris Austin, crossed the floor to join the PCs. So PCs have a majority by now, but they not only quit the party, but Chris Austin, under New Brunswick elections law, actually had the power to deregister the party, to sign it out of official existence in the eyes of Elections New Brunswick, and that had consequences for the money they had in the bank and various other, whether they appear on a ballot and so on. So he didn't just close the barn door behind him; he kind of set fire to the barn. So this was relevant, as I just mentioned, in these by-elections because they've been a factor, even though they haven't won either of those ridings. So what then happened is a few people from the party board got together and decided to reconstitute the party. So they had to go through various electoral law hoops. And the party has been re-registered now, so it exists. It has candidates on the ballot. It has a leader in place who was chosen at a small convention a few weeks ago. And actually, he was the third MLA elected in 2018, and he lost in 2020. So he's back on the scene as the leader without a seat in the House. So that's where they stand. I mean, in one way, it was kind of a classic Canadian political story in our system where a party on the margins or an elected member or two on the margins kind of realize that they can maybe have a bit more clout if they're in a mainstream party that can hold power or that is holding power. And that's what they decided. So that's the alliance. That's where things are at with them as we head into these by-elections.
It's a little bit reminiscent of what happened with Wildrose ahead of the Alberta election back in 2015. Danielle Smith and her party pretty much wholesale joined Jim Prentice and the PCs, and then they were all more or less defeated in the next election.
How did that go for them?
Not pretty well,
Yes.
But the difference being Higgs here at least is not heading to an election in the next couple of months, except for these by-elections.
That's right. And the other difference, of course, is that at one point it looked like Wildrose was actually going to win the previous election, and they didn't. And there was never any possibility of the alliance doing that. But nonetheless, yes, sort of a mainstream PC party and then another party on the right, less mainstream, was kind of nibbling at their lunch. And then in this maneuver in March, Blaine Higgs basically or seem to have eliminated them as an electoral factor, as an electoral threat.
So this will be a bit of a test to see what happens with the People's Alliance, because they do have candidates in these two ridings. As you mentioned, this is an area of Miramichi where the party has had some success in the past. So we have two by-elections in Southwest Miramichi Bay and Miramichi Bay Neguac. Tell us a little bit about these two.
Well, they're both interesting ridings. There's some similarities and some differences. Both are majority Anglophone ridings with, I would say, significant Francophone populations. And the reason I bring that up is because in New Brunswick, language plays into political dynamic often, especially in these ridings that have these somewhat mixed populations. When the riding was created in the last boundary redistricting, Anglophones were 57% in Miramichi Bay, Neguac, and Francophones were 36%. So that's a pretty solid chunk of the vote. And in most elections, let's stick with that riding for a minute. In most elections, that 36% Francophone vote has kind of been an insurance policy for the Liberals. The PCs have won it at times when there have been, kind of PC sweeps or real wave elections. But generally, it's been a good insurance policy for the Liberals because that vote tends to go Liberal. And then in the other riding, Southwest Miramichi Bay Devin, the Anglophone share of the vote is much larger. It has voted Liberal in the past, but has been solidly PC now for 4 elections. And if I can just zoom out for a second with a bit of history, I mean, generally, for most of the 20th century, the Francophones tended to vote Liberal in New Brunswick, Anglophones tended to vote PC with some exceptions. What happened over the last 30 or 40 years is we saw a couple of PC leaders really try to bring Francophones into the PC party and make the party competitive in those ridings. And the Liberals would win in Anglophone areas at times as well, including when Frank McKenna won all the seats in the legislature. But
must have included some Anglophone ridings when
for
you win
sure,
all of them.
you'd think, yeah. But for 15 or 20 years ago, both parties were fishing in both pools, and there's a lot of analysis of what happened over the last couple of elections, but things tended to repolarize back to the way things had looked in the 20th century, for most of the 20th century, which is that Francophones were voting overwhelmingly Liberal, and their caucus was overwhelmingly from Francophone ridings. PCs were getting the overwhelming majority of Anglophone votes. The Liberal vote was very inefficient where it existed in English New Brunswick, and the PC caucus was overwhelmingly English. And, just as a personal observation, I don't think it's healthy when these two mainstream parties, when voters don't see themselves reflected in these two mainstream parties, because it means that someone's being taken for granted for their votes. So that's why these by-elections are significant in part. In Miramichi Bay, Neguac, the PCs have recruited a former MLA who was elected in one of these wave elections, Régent Savoie, who's Acadian from Neguac. And so they've been quite strategic. It's quite a chess move because that is where they would be weaker. It's where the Liberals would tend to be stronger. That area was their insurance policy. So the PCs are really kind of going into that Liberal turf and trying to win it with Savoie. In the other riding in Southwest Miramichi Bay Devin, both of the candidates are Anglophone from what's called upriver, upper Miramichi, and we'll see how competitive that is. That may be more prone to just kind of stick with the recent pattern of PC wins. But if the PCs were to win Miramichi Bay, Neguac, it would be a big deal because they only have one Francophone MLA in their caucus. So they would be doubling the Francophone representation in their caucus and maybe putting to rest a lot of the issues that Blaine Higgs has had with Francophone New Brunswick, which we can get into if you want.
Yeah, well, what is the expectation here? Because as you mentioned in Southwest Miramichi, maybe not going to be that competitive as much as the other riding. But the polls that I've seen in New Brunswick are not suggesting that Blaine Higgs and the PCs are terribly popular either, right? So winning something, in this case being an incumbent government whose numbers aren't terrible, but they're not great either, would seem to be a good thing. Is it something that is likely, or at least is the expectation that it is something that could actually happen? They can win that Liberal seat away.
Well, I don't do modeling, as you know, but and I will say about the other riding, I mean, I said it and you said it, that the traditional pattern might assert itself there, but the Liberal candidate's a seasoned organizer, Hannah Fulton Johnson. She's from Doketown, which is kind of the heart of conservative territory in that riding. You never know what could happen there. She's got a former People's Alliance candidate supporting her, who's from Doketown. So it's largely because she's from Doketown, but nonetheless, I wouldn't rule anything out, I guess. But and sorry, so getting back to your question about Miramichi Bay, Neguac, what was it again? Like how?
Yeah, well, just the idea that the PCs would like to take away this Liberal seat.
Yeah.
But for looking at where they are in the polls, it's kind of neck and neck between the two parties province-wide.
Yeah, that's right. You would know better than I, but I think by-elections can buck those trends. This is a riding that could decide that they will lend the seat to the PCs for a couple of years because they know who's in government for the next 2 years. So they may decide it's to their advantage in very practical terms to vote PC. So the prospect of the PCs winning both seats, including the one that they didn't hold going in, is an interesting scenario, and a lot of people are talking about it. The PCs are bullish on it. They're not dunking, but they feel they can squeak it out. Now, of course, the Liberals would say otherwise, and the Greens think that they have a shot. They think they have a shot at making this a three-way race. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, that's something to talk about. The Greens in New Brunswick have a few seats. They're usually third in the polls. Right. So they are also a factor as well, although this area is not one of the ones where they've had the most strength.
That's right. It's not. They've got a candidate, Chad Duplessis, who is a Miramichi city councillor. There's a portion of that riding that is in the city of Miramichi. And, so as a municipal councillor, he's got some profile. And this is one of the things that has been behind the Greens' relative success in New Brunswick, is that they have found it increasingly easy to recruit candidates who have some profile. They're not nobodies. They're people who have a track record in the community in some way. So I don't know whether they'll pull it off really, but they're in the race and they're campaigning hard. Ran into one of the Green MLAs today, Kevin Arsenault, who was campaigning with Chad Duplessis. So they're in it, and so I won't make a prediction, but I will say that's the by-election of the two that's where I'm going to be next Monday night. Put it that way.
For the PCs and Blaine Higgs in particular. So they hope to have a good performance here. Maybe they can win 2 for 2 or put up a fight. What does it mean for the PCs going forward? Because Higgs has now been in power for 4 years. The next election is not for another 2 years. So he's starting to get to a 6-year term. Does Higgs need some good news for his own personal leadership? Does the party need some good news for someone to want to take over if he decided to step aside? What's the future for the PCs right now?
Yeah, I think it would be an enormous boost if the PCs won it. So we had that Angus Reid poll a few days ago that had Higgs among the least popular premiers in the country with 33% approval rating, I think it was. You can correct me on that. And then Narrative Research, which is sort of the go-to polling in Atlantic Canada, they had in their last poll last month, they had dissatisfaction at 52%, satisfaction at 40%. So that's not great. They had the Liberals and the PCs tied in voting intention, and they had Higgs and the interim Liberal leader and the Green Party leader all within the margin of error on preferred premier. So those are not great numbers for Blaine Higgs. Plus, he had this huge dip in the polls last November after the early lifting of mask requirements and other COVID measures. We saw this spike in cases, and his numbers just tanked. They've come back up since then, but they're not back to the lead he had. Plus, we've got inflation in general, that sort of general issue that's just kind of feeding kind of voter irritation at best. And the Liberals in question period in the legislature in the last few weeks have been quite effective at hammering that issue, and the government eventually did come up with some measures to try to help. And there's just sort of like a cantankerous mood like we've seen elsewhere. So, it's the numbers haven't been disastrous for Higgs, but they haven't been great. And there were grumblings in his caucus last fall that when's this guy going to go, and should he go soon or should he go later? So I think a by-election win, especially with a new Francophone member, would really put that to rest, at least for a while. Now, that doesn't change the fact that he would be 70 years old in the next provincial election in 2024. He will have to decide eventually whether to stick around and seek another term at age 70. Joe Biden would call him young, I guess, but that decision is coming, and there are some progressive conservatives who think that he needs to signal that not imminently, but maybe early 2023 at the latest, because there are concerns in the party that if he waits too late, too close to the next election, we get into a John Turner or Kim Campbell scenario where a new leader is sort of stuck with the baggage of the previous premier and takes the party down to defeat. So that's a concern.
Is there a risk for the Higgs if these by-elections go badly?
Well, I mean, again, the polling's not great. There was sort of grumbling in the caucus already. The COVID thing last fall was a real blow because he'd kind of been coasting on good management of COVID up until that point. So yeah, I think status quo would be status quo. If the PC's lost both of them, then we might see the grumbling get a little louder. But the stars, I think, would really have to align for the Liberals to win both, or for the Liberals to win one and the Greens to win one.
Well, then let's talk about the Liberals. So opposition now, Kevin Vickers was the leader in the last election. It didn't go particularly well for the Liberals in that campaign. They're in the midst of a leadership race. So what's the field and what's the betting money right now?
Well, there's
not that we encourage political betting. We don't.
No, we don't. There are four candidates. There's TJ Harvey, who's a former Liberal MP, represented Tobic Mactaquac, which was generally trends conservative. He won it in 2015. So a lot of people say, well, he won a conservative riding. Of course, he won it in the Trudeau wave. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure if that's a measure of him or something else. But he decided not to seek a second term in 2019, and now he's back in politics. There's Donald Arsenault, who's a former Liberal cabinet minister provincially. There's Susan Holt, who has never held elective office, but worked for Premier Brian Gallant and ran for the party in 2018 and lost to the Green Party leader in Fredericton. And then there's Robert Gauvin, who's kind of the interesting plot line in that, because he was a PC cabinet minister, and he's the son of a Acadian political PC icon from the Hatfield era. And he was elected in 2018, Higgs's only Francophone MLA at that time. And then because of a ill-fated plan to change some rural hospital hours, he quit the PC caucus, became a Liberal, ran for the Liberals, got elected, and is now running for the Liberal leadership. So I don't know if you've ever run any data on this phenomenon, but someone who was a member of a PC cabinet 2.5 years ago is now a Liberal leadership candidate. Do you have any numbers that predict how often that can happen?
I mean, you'd have to think about it. What was the path with Scott Bryson? Didn't he not run at some point? He didn't win. Although I do think, if I remember correctly, Nancy Macbeth in Alberta, she had been a cabinet minister, I believe, in the Ralph Klein governments, and eventually ran the Alberta Liberals out there. But
yeah, and then there was Paul Hellyer in the distant past,
yes,
who kind of ran for several parties. And
see, the common thread though between all of these are that none of them became premiers or prime ministers. So
right,
maybe that's not good news for Robert Gauvin.
I always say that a floor crosser's value to the party they are crossing to is never higher than on the day they cross. They are the king at that time, or the queen, as the case may be. But But will Liberals want to vote for someone who was that recently a progressive conservative? That's the question. So anyhow, the Liberals are using a preferential ballot. They have a weighted system by riding, similar to the federal Conservatives and what they're going through now. So, the candidates have to compete in all parts of the province for votes here and there and try to get a percentage of the votes in this riding and that riding to get points. So it's hard to say what's going to happen. I mean, everybody is talking about, of course, as always happens in these kinds of preferential ballot races, what's the second round strategy for every candidate? Who are they trying to win over? Whose second choice do they want to be? Or who are the people voting for which candidate who they want to be the second choice for?
Right.
And there's all kinds of scenarios. The consensus seems to be that TJ Harvey, who got in early and snapped up a lot of endorsements and organizers, is probably in an advantageous position. But does he get to 50% of the points on the first ballot? And if he falls short, does someone else win it as a result? I don't think he's in a Pierre Poilievre position where there's a lot of stop him kind of sentiment. So it may well be that he doesn't get to 50%, but a lot of people like him and have him as their second choice, and he easily goes over the top on the second round.
Are you expecting that the divide is going to be the same kind of linguistic divide? Because you have two, I guess, Acadian candidates and two that are from English, New Brunswick, or is it more of a left-right kind of thing within the party?
There's not really, they haven't really been fighting over policy. I did a story asking them what their plan was to maybe try to win some support from Green voters, because that's really been the Liberals' problem the last couple of elections. And there really wasn't a definitive answer. No one sort of tilted Green the way, Justin Trudeau did, for example, to grab progressive voters on climate policy. No, I mean, they tend to all be talking about renewal and bringing the party back. So it's hard to predict. There are four candidates who have some stature, but who aren't necessarily stars either. And we'll see what happens.
How is the party setting itself up against the PCs in the next election? Because I guess one of the factors is they don't know who they're going to be up against, maybe. Yeah,
that's right. So I talked about this by-election choice of candidates being a bit of a chess game with the PCs going into Liberal territory to recruit their candidate. And of course, the Liberals don't know who they're counter-programming against because, again, the PCs have tended to be strong in English New Brunswick lately, Liberals in French New Brunswick. So if the Liberals are going to be facing Blaine Higgs in the next election, who, has had a bad reputation among Francophones, they might pick a TJ Harvey who can go into PC ridings and contest them. If, however, Higgs retires and the PCs pick Daniel Alain as their new leader. He's a cabinet minister from Moncton, the only Francophone currently in the caucus, and a very good kind of folksy retail politician. Well, if the PCs pick him and the Liberals have a TJ Harvey, maybe some Francophone ridings start to think, well, we're being taken for granted by the Liberals, and this Daniel Alain guy, it doesn't seem so bad. I mean, Daniel Alain has just piloted this major local government reform through the legislature, and in the process has been to every town and village in every part of New Brunswick, including Francophone New Brunswick. So he's got a good network in place.
Do you think that was deliberate or just a happy coincidence?
I'm sure it was all policy driven, Eric. It always is. But Alain's an effective communicator, effective politician, and it's not impossible to imagine the Liberals going with someone that they think would beat Higgs, and then something different happening. So then but the Liberals can't know. They just can't know who it's going to be, because if it were Alain, they might pick someone else.
Oh, that's a dilemma, and they don't have a time sheet.
It is.
So
it is. Yeah. So that it's sort of like, you go first. No, you go first.
Yeah. Okay. So while they do know that, David Kuhn will presumably still be the Green leader for the next election, he's, been able to win his seat, done well for the Greens. But the other factor is just because it's recent news for the New Democrats. Now, this is not a party that has had a lot of success in New Brunswick. I believe the last time they won a seat was in 2003. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And
So,
they had 1.6% of the popular vote in the last provincial election.
Right, which is not particularly high. So Mackenzie Thomason was the leader. He was the interim leader. He had to come in, and then they made him permanent because I guess they needed someone in there. He was at the debate, and he was in that campaign. But there's been like a lot of drama for a party that had, as you said, 1.6% of the vote and no seats.
Yeah, it's a real conundrum for New Democrats, the few that remain, because they have really struggled. They've gone through a number of leaders. They've had leadership races where no one was interested, where most of the candidates were disqualified and someone was acclaimed. Thomason, then because of COVID, their leadership process was thrown into disarray, so that Thomason actually had to lead the party into the last election as the interim leader. And did very poorly in the riding he ran in, 1.6% of the popular vote. What's really happening here is that the Greens have taken up all the oxygen on the left in New Brunswick and have actually succeeded beyond what the NDP ever achieved, because they've got 3 seats. But it's a long story and a lot of dynamics about how we got to this point, but a lot of former New Democrats, sort of middle of the road New Democrats, what I might call Saskatchewan New Democrats, went to the Greens and are solid Green supporters. And now, of course, the Greens have got a caucus. They've got a caucus budget. They've got staff. They've got resources. They make videos about, the Green Week at the legislature. Here's what we did. Here are the bills we introduced. Here's how we voted. They get some public funding in the per vote formula in New Brunswick. Whereas the NDP has no seats, hasn't had a seat since, in almost 2 decades. Their per vote subsidy is almost nothing, and I don't know what their solution is. I mean, it's hard to imagine them disappearing, although they were late again with their filings with Elections New Brunswick, their financial filings, and that's they can be deregistered for missing too many of those deadlines. So I'm not sure what they're going to do. It's hard to imagine a party that, essentially holds the balance of power at the federal level in Ottawa vanishing from the map, from the ballot in New Brunswick. But it is a difficult situation for them. And as long as the Greens are there and sort of continue to enjoy that virtuous cycle of, winning leads to publicity and resources leads to more winning, it's going to be tough for the NDP.
Maybe the New Democrats out in the Maritimes are to what the Liberals are in Western Canada and Alberta and Saskatchewan. They're non-existent anymore. They're parties that get 1% of the vote if things are lucky for them. So maybe that's a future for the NDP.
At one point, Mackenzie Thomason offered to run sort of unity candidates in these by-elections. He said, well, if the Liberals, Greens, and NDP can agree, we'll just run a single candidate to try to beat the PCs. But then he said, but the candidate can't be a Liberal. He didn't exactly have a lot of bargaining power to insist on that. And in the end, they failed to get candidates nominated in these by-elections. So that's not great.
Well, that brings me to my closing question, and we can finish it off on this. So going back to the by-elections, the People's Alliance is going to be there. The NDP, as you said, doesn't have a candidate. But if we end up at the end of these by-elections, the results come in, the PCs are able to win one or both, and the People's Alliance vote is not really all that important, and there's a big divide again on the Liberals and the Greens. What does it say for New Brunswick politics going forward? Because you do have, with the People's Alliance, maybe not as much of a going concern, the PCs being a lot stronger, and you have this divide that's on the left that didn't exist before 2014. Where do politics in New Brunswick go from here over the next couple of years?
Well, if all those things happen, and I'm not predicting they will, but if all those things happened, we'd have a strange situation where the Premier is not super popular, not super loved, not totally the object of complete affection, even from some in his caucus, and yet in a relatively strong political position, like relatively solid, with very little threat from the alliance, and as you say, a divided opposition. So this is why I think if they gain a seat in Miramichi Bay, Neguac, it's a real kind of watershed moment for this premier who's kind of stumbled into power through a confidence vote in the legislature in 2018, and then picked up this majority win, but not a landslide majority win over COVID. And so this might be the beginning of the post-COVID Blaine Higgs era of the party, and he'd be going into that with with a relatively good political position. And
the opposition will have to figure out what to do going forward, because it's been a couple elections now where they haven't really been able to kind of build enough support and build enough momentum to knock off the PCs, who, have you said, have not been, you're looking at the polling over the last 4 years, have never or very rarely been a very popular party in the province. But because of that linguistic divide, because of the divide on the left, are in, as you said, a pretty strong electoral position.
Yeah, and the one thing I'll add too about that whole dynamic is that Justin Trudeau obviously made a very conscious choice 2014-2015 to tack left, right, and to go after some of the issues that have animated the NDP over the years, like electoral reform. We know how that turned out, legalized cannabis, all these things. And the Liberals in New Brunswick have not done that. I think they're more cautious. I think they see it as more of a risk. Maybe it is a risk. Maybe they're overestimating the risk, but they have yet to make any bold moves to go into to try to get that green vote and that what's left of that NDP vote. So maybe we'll see something like that from the new leader, or maybe we won't. But at the moment, things feel kind of static in that regard.
Well, we'll see if the by-elections on Monday are going to shake things up, and maybe suddenly there'll be even more drama coming out in New Brunswick. So, Jacques, I really appreciate you taking the time talking to me from Miramichi, and hope you enjoy your time there.
Well, thank you. As a paying subscriber, I'm happy to join you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Jacques.
Bye.
Thanks to Jacques Poitras for that discussion, and thank you for watching. If you did like this video, I hope that you will like it and you will share it with other people who might like it too, and subscribe to this YouTube channel. I'm always trying to post new stuff, and with the next couple months looking pretty busy in politics, could be a lot going on in this channel. So until next time, thanks for watching.